addition to a full medical school and full nursing school online, Lecturio also has short courses. Have you been asked to do short courses about digital literacy, about how to use,
Yeah,
mobile
yeah, yeah, yeah.
platforms?
It's a good question. So we certainly, in general, before ChatGPT already believed that it makes sense to train clinicians not only in medicine. They're part of complex systems, they're part of teams, so you need to train them in business, in negotiation, and communication, and these kinds of things for these systems to function properly. And we've also got trainings on digitalization, and we've got trainings on ChatGPT and these kinds of things, and they're actually part in our, kind of online platforms that we put into local control. That's always an important part, since we discussed global north and south, the contents we did for nurses and technicians in Ethiopia are produced by local local experts on the local devices that they have, which happen to be Chinese, but they need to maintain them and use them, right? And so these broader topics are, I think, quite important. So to have a sort of a base understanding, I think, is very helpful. But in the end, it's also asking quite a lot, to think that people are asked to judge, which tool to use and not use and whatnot. And obviously, I think I encourage everybody to learn, but also I think we need to get to the point where the disease societies and the regulators in each country will point out, what are safe uses, and just like we accredit a drug, there should be some sort of form of accreditation for introducing AI into clinical practice. There's obviously huge benefit, and I think it's always important to remember, if you're in rural Ethiopia somewhere and you're a nurse and you're faced with a patient with a life-threatening condition, there may not be maybe no surgeon available, and you may have tricky decisions to make in terms of what you do and what you don't do. But at least you can get a lot more support on the decision making these days, and actually making these things available. And I used to work in prevention and population health management. I think it's great that we can now leverage all these data to coach people through watches and phones. One of the things I recall from that is, there's one thing to tell people that smoking is unhealthy, but actually getting them to change behavior is a whole different order. So the digital coach, I think, ideally should be combined with some kind of, incentive mechanisms, and traditionally, if things affect people's wallets, then they will tend to act on it more. So I kind of envision kind of nice, I'm not sure if you want to call them nice, but potentially efficient systems that can actually track and reward behavior, the healthy kind of behavior, because it takes that nudge. We find that in education, for example, as well. Like we have this spaced retrieval algorithm. A lot of education systems are still stuck in cram and forget. Main thing, you pass the exam, doesn't matter when you get to the next exam, you already forgot 90% of what you were supposed to know in the previous exam. So the science, spaced retrieval learning, Ebbinghaus curve, all of that has been there for a long time, right? But for an educational setting to achieve the students adhering to long-term mastery, they need to set incentives, unless the student gets extra points or grade points or things like that, they're not going to change their behavior. And similar to the health coach, I think, so ideally we need to kind of get some incentives embedded in these things. I don't know, micropayment rewards, and somebody sponsors them or whatever. The insurance companies can do that, obviously, for their insured potentially. I think there are very interesting things possible if we combine the right data with the right AI, with the right incentives. Then I think a lot could be possible on the preventive side of things.
That's great. And a lot of interesting ideas there. I love what you said about the accreditation of, some of the AI systems. Like, for example, I would see in the US, our FDA, our Food and Drug Administration would accredit certain apps, because they're being used to treat people the same way a drug or, surgical procedure is used to treat people. And I imagine what will happen on the practical level, just to use myself as an example, I, as a pediatrician, there might be very general apps approved by the American Board of Pediatrics, which applies to all pediatricians in the country. But then the specific hospital I use might say I can use this specific app, which might be, a more specialized app. So it'd be interesting to see that the regulation will occur both at the national level, but also probably at the institutional level. That's an interesting point. Do any of our other panelists want to tackle that question about, adding sort of digital literacy to health workers' skills of teaching them how to work with AI, when to trust it, when not to trust it, when to use it, when not to use it? and maybe while people are thinking about that, we have another question by Michaela Byrne about what are the panel's thoughts on the new EU regulation in Brussels, that came out just recently about artificial intelligence regulation. My guess is it's probably too early for people to have an opinion, but if anyone has thoughts on that, because the EU really has been in the lead of trying to regulate artificial intelligence.
I think you're right. It's too early, right? It's a good first step, but in general, society needs to figure out how to use it first before it can be regulated. And right now, we just don't know what the use cases are. I think those will develop over time. Regulation will have to play catch up, but it's good that they're getting out in front and taking a stand, at least as a starting point.
That's great. Anyone else want to comment on that? I wanted to build upon I think David Bryan's comment about, is AI going to be used to sort of poor solutions for poor people rather than giving them humans? And I think the risk cuts both ways. One is that AI may end up being expensive, certain types, and only be accessible to wealthy patients. But then on the other hand, cheaper forms of AI, may be pushed on poorer patients. I just wanted people's thoughts, on that and how we can prevent that from happening, how we can keep an eye on that issue of AI, worsening inequality one way or another versus improving equality. Any takers on that?
I would just say that I think while there is some risk to that segregation of care, right, between wealthy and poor individuals, in general, worldwide, we're seeing a massive labor shortage that we just can't keep up with, right? The demand for bringing care to any level. I was in the Netherlands recently, and I think they were saying 1 in 6 workers are now destined for the healthcare profession, trending towards 1 in 4 over the next 10 to 15 years. Like, we just can't sustain that. So the only way to solve that, if we can't lessen the demand, is to increase the supply. And AI is really the only possible way to do that without radically changing how we're delivering care.
Right, that's fantastic. And I think actually that put me in a train of thought that a lot of the new demand for health workers is going to be for taking care of frail elderly people. And people automatically think about the physical aspect of that. And Japan's done a lot of work with robots, but it's difficult because older people want the warm smile, they want the warm hand. But Kurt, as you pointed out, it's not just about doing the intervention, but using the data to find out who needs the intervention. Or if you have 100 fragile elderly in a nursing home, then the nurse can only see 10 in her night shift. Which 10 of those should she see? So it's about better allocation of those human workers. Question I wanted to put out to the panel is, how are you comparing clinical practice or clinical outcomes by humans to what the AI can do? Because I think actually Amer brought this out, that he feels that AI has to be an enhancement. It has to offer something additional. And we often focus in AI on the potential errors or problems, but we don't look enough at the errors or problems that humans have. And how do we compare quality of care that's provided sort of exclusively by humans or under current standards versus the possibilities with humans and AI? Dr. Rainey, are you still with us?
I'll just share one brief thought here. I've often thought when we think about nutrition, for example, there's sort of, there's a lot of research on what's healthy eating, what mix of foods, but it's all fairly macro, like eat your 5 vegetables and certain foods and not too much fats and with this type of fat and that type of fat. And if you think about, all the micronutrients like ginseng in Chinese medicine, lowering blood sugar after a meal, just one little example, but like so many micronutrients that it can affect your mood, energy, performance, well-being, might prevent disease, etc. And we're still in such a crude sort of state there in terms of what we actually recommend and how finely we dose. And I think one of the big potentials for AI is to deal with a vastly richer data set per patient, the patient's genetics, the patient's family history, the patient's lifestyle, the patient's own goals in terms of well-being, whatever, they can differ quite materially, between an athlete and an academic and whatever else, and so then to take that full set of data about the patient, their conditions, the interactions between the conditions, etc., and come up with much richer guidance and plans in terms of not just take this drug, but what's the optimal nutrition regime, what is the right frequency of check-ins, what should you be monitoring, and how does an app assist with the monitoring of that when you next need to be seen by a care worker, and so on. I think there's just a lot of potential richness there, which the AI will help unfold. Also on the research side, I shared this link to openevidence.com. I don't know if everybody here is familiar with it, but it's quite fascinating. You have all the research evidence, the latest articles, but the AI helps you navigate it, helps you summarize it, puts a tag on how credible the source is, gives you a summary. So just the speed up that a researcher can get when they're looking and have a new idea to maybe research something in the lab or something, like the power of that versus just browsing with search and then reading each article and so on. I think it's very powerful, and we're going to see a lot of acceleration there. There are already exciting examples, but still AI gets things wrong. So you can't just put it in and get the right cancer treatment. There are examples and articles published like that, but as you also said, we tend to then assume that the human benchmark is perfect, and back to my earlier example, in the online discussion forum, the AI was both smarter, more reliable data-wise, and more empathic. So let's not underestimate the potential, because a lot of those errors, obviously, these hallucinations, etc. If you look at how fast it's been, progressing, I think in a few months, already you'll have a very different picture on that. That doesn't mean we trust it blindly, but we need to see the upsides and manage the downsides. And it's a fast evolving, complex beast for sure for all of us, right?
We also might see a world in which a patient has a choice. So the physician might say, do you want us to use AI in your case, or do you want us not? Or, what do you want my level of involvement to be, and what do you want AI's level of involvement to be? So it might end up being a choice, because we often, present these things as sort of black or white, and not that there's a whole spectrum of ways that we can integrate and we can actually bring in patient consent, into a lot of these things.
And those will
I
be
think
very fascinating meta-level trials, just to throw in that thought. I haven't seen any yet, but when we talk about patient populations treated only by physicians,
yep.
or by AI, or by a mix thereof, and we might see what we saw in chess. In chess, it was initially the humans dominated, then the computers won, then the humans plus computers won, but eventually the computer outperformed the human plus computer version, and the human didn't have anything to add. Slightly scary scenario, but for some aspects of healthcare, like putting together diagnostic pieces of information, deciding what the next right test might be, etc., we may well be on the early stages of a similar path. So
absolutely, I agree 100% with that. I think we all know that from a lot of research, we know it takes about a decade or more for new advances to go from considered best practice. I'm not just talking about one article, but that the American Society of Cardiology decides something's best practice to when it's implemented. And I think that for all the panelists here, we're seeing an integration of practice and education. And how do you see AI speeding the degree to which health workers integrate the latest developments into their practice, whether it's feedback from the AI or the guidelines popping up on your screen when it sees that you're dealing with a patient with a heart attack. So how do you see AI sort of integrating education and practice and bringing these the agreed upon advancements faster to the physician's office? Emma, do you want to comment on that? Because your AI is diagnosing very complex images, which have a lot of different diagnostic criteria. you might have lost it. Let's see. Okay, I think that might be all of our questions. We've had two amazing panels. I think, as usual, with good conversations, raised more questions than we've answered. But I know I certainly have learned a lot, and there's a lot that I need to think about from this. But certainly from the education panel, we see that there issues and concerns over, how much should be online, should be AI versus, face-to-face training, who has access to this? Is it just about improving general clinical training, or should we add digital literacy to the content as well? And in the panel on clinical practice, you see that there's a wide variety of ways that AI can help in looking at data and seeing who is more likely to have a problem and needs attention versus making a diagnosis, versus making a treatment plan, or even in some of the things that Kurt said, what type of intervention is best for you. Actually, Kurt, one of the things that you said that really opened up my mind was, like, I know that sort of I need to exercise more, and that an app could help with that. But the idea that the app would help me figure out what's going to help me exercise more. Is it support from a community? Is it peer pressure? Is it a daily reminder? Is it I actually have a bicycle underneath my desk as a reminder to use that. That AI really cuts across all interventions in wellness and clinical care. So I want to thank all the sponsors of the session, Anadach, Corvus Health, and the Yuan, our media partner, and thank all of our incredible panelists. Your companies are doing amazing things, and I think really pushing the envelope to help get high quality healthcare to all people. And if anyone has any last thoughts that they want to share, be happy to hear that. Okay, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate everyone's participation. We'll give you a few minutes of your time back. Egbe?
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, I think this was a really interesting conversation. I would like to thank the speakers and the panelists. And I noticed David ended with a interesting provocation on the Minister of Health. And I wonder, have a suicide and rather than health therapist, we'll chat online. But I think what you said, okay, that this has really opened the mind and conversation to both what can be done and maybe some of the challenges, which I think David is pointing out. But I think one of the bigger issues is really when you look at populations. And I tell folks, you said, one of the drivers for increased healthcare workers globally, it's really the aging population. And when you look in Europe, where 1 in 4 people are over 60. And in Africa, where 1 in 5%, I don't know, 1 in 15 people are over 60. Where do you think the healthcare workers from the world are going to come from? And so I think where we think about AI, and as you think about many countries themselves who are either exporters of healthcare workers, but also are going through epidemiological transitions themselves, how can we address this for the population as a whole and in LMIC countries without looking at how you can use technology to do this more effectively? In my view, it's happened in the financial sector, and I think in healthcare, and that's why I do think that healthcare workers need to be more informed about how to use this, and that was one reason why we had this conversation. So I really would love to thank again everybody for participating and the team behind us, the Anadach team led by the Solar, the Corvus